But what we've learned is that there's literally an endless trail of why questions that ultimately leads to say I don't know. Like that's basically the logical end of any question, of any sort of sequence of why questions. And it becomes you're now in a world where you actually can't explain and you can't say why. But if you want to have those explanations before you commit to something, then you're going to never commit to any action ever in your life.
I'm curious about like why things work, just in general. Like, I know I love to like inspect like mechanical structures to try and piece together how they work or why they were designed in a certain way. I am curious about why, and that I don't know at the nested I don't know at the bottom of everything. I find quite frustrating because I'm like, well, there has to be a good explanation. Ultimately, the lack of an explanation right now just means that we haven't got around to figuring that out yet. It's not that it's fundamentally unknowable. What does progress on the why question look like to you? But yeah, I was just saying, I feel like the world feels dodgy right now. It's like America could get involved with bombing Iran with Israel, but then it's like, are we like in a more of a World War I situation or more of a World War II situation? Like World War I, the lesson was there's always like entangled, complex alliances that could snowball and catastrophically lead to everyone somehow being at war with each other at the same time. But then you've also got the World War II situation where it's like, how much do you appease a dictator before there's like which lessons are more worth learning? Like, is it a little bit World War I and a bit and more World War II? Is it more World War II, a bit less World War I? The thing that I think overall is scaring is the big similarity with World War I is this massive technological overhang that we have. It's in the same way that World War I started with cavalry charges and ended with tanks. It feels like with the technological overhang of like robotics being where it is, AI being where it is, drone technology in particular being where it is, um, if if a war were to start, it would get very, I don't know, technological very quickly, and it would not end how it started. And I guess the last thing I think I learned from those conflicts is that war is very easy to start, but it's very hard to stop. It's pretty easy to invade your neighbor, but it's really hard to see where that ends. And so if you start getting involved with like bombing Iran, like it's hard to see where that ends, basically. All of a sudden you're drawn into a conflict.
Yeah. Just to be clear, it's not just bombing Iran, it's like bombing their
Nuclear facilities.
nuclear
Yeah,
facilities that they should have by international law.
I agree. I'm just saying you're still like sending your planes there to drop your
I
bombs.
agree. I just think that like that part is definitely missing from the the narrative. Um, but no, I agree with you. It's a scary situation the world is in because I think Trump campaigned on this on the idea that he was a peacemaker, but then things actually seem to be escalating in a way where just seems very worrying to a lot of people. So yeah, I don't know what to make of it either. I still deep down believe that he does want peace in the world. I don't see him as a warmonger that a lot of people might see him as. So I'll just have to, I guess, have faith that he ultimately wants peace in the world. But it's definitely a scary situation. I can't deny the fact that I've been worried as well when I read the news.
I think he overestimates how easy it would be to
Mm-hmm.
end these things completely. He'd say, "Oh, I'd have the Israel-Palestine thing over, I'd have the Iran thing over, I'd have the Russia situation over," and all those things 6 months in, arguably worse than
Yeah,
they were 6 months ago.
yeah. I think this is interesting. It reminds me a lot about the conversation that we had last time about how um, about people having different views of the world and operating under different modes of
The
culture
framework.
of like living. Like for example, you made this, you distinguished the sort of, well, Trump actually distinguished the Arabian way versus the typical Western way, and you kind of alluded to the fact that Trump acknowledged that there was more than one way of uh, governing and operating a society. But I think actually this is the crux of Trump's issue here, is that Trump has succeeded in life by making deals. Like that is how he would summarize himself, as a deal maker, as someone that's
Art of the
able to
deal.
broker deals. Art of the deal. It's I listened to a biography about Trump, about how his dad was in real estate outside of New York, not necessarily in the center of Manhattan. But then Trump basically took a lot of learnings from his dad, and then he went into the center of New York and tried to build really impressive buildings there. The stuff that he was able to get past was very impressive for someone of his experience level and his stage in life. And he's basically been on this wave of making insane deals that have been able to not just make himself prosperous, but I guess his sort of tight knit community that he's had, and he's sort of grown this following all through his career, to the point where you've got Trump fanatics that just sort of have they treat everything that he says as gospel in a way, which is obviously not great. But my point is that he's been making deals with people in the West, and Western people, you're right, have this way that they operate. But now he's on the world stage and he's trying to make deals with someone, with the leader of Russia. He's trying to make deals with the Iranians. He's trying to make deals with people that actually don't operate under the same worldview that he does, or that Western people typically do. And so I think he's found it really easy to make deals, because when he's approaching someone and he says, look, I want to make a deal. This is what I want. This is what you want. He's able to sort of create a formula. He's able to rationalize the parts of the deal, and ultimately what he can understand what his counterpart wants. And I think ultimately when you make a deal, I think you and I both know this, like working in sales, a huge part of it is listening and understanding what are your needs and what are your problems that I can help fix for you. And that's how you approach a deal, rather than I have this thing that I just want to sell to you. It's about what do you want, and it's about that, having that understanding of what the other entity or your counterpart wants. And that might make sense within a framework of Western Judeo-Christian values and a worldview where we all want something that's under this umbrella. But now he's interacting with the Russians, the Iranians, Israel, who operate under a completely different umbrella, under a completely different framework. And I think that this is why he's really struggling to make deals with these guys, is because what he's not able to, he might understand what it is that they want, but it's, in order to make a deal, he's going to have to, like, I don't know, just completely well, I don't know what the solution is, obviously, but I think that that's the main crux of the issue, is that he isn't really able to give everyone what they want at the same time. And that's the issue, is that there's lots of competing interests. And in a world where each country is operating under a different framework, it's almost impossible to make sure that they have both that they both have what they want at the end of this. I find.
Yeah, not everyone can win. I would push back a little bit on some of the points you made there. I mean, for example, Ukraine and Russia are both Christian countries, right? They're both Orthodox Christian countries. So there is more of an overlap. I think Russia, from my like kind of study of history, there's just this like, if you go back to kind of what was his name? I think it was Alexander during the Congress of Vienna. There's just this Russian method of negotiating which is fundamentally like irrational. but they use this like kind of irrationality completely to their advantage. And it's kind of strange if you almost like conceptually try to structure irrationality because, for example, like there are various points at which the Russian Tsar at the time during the Congress of Vienna was completely willing to just let the world collapse back into world war over like minor points of negotiation, or he would just take personal issue with like Metternich, who was the Austrian negotiator. He'd behave in very irrational ways. He'd be like, run up and kiss someone on the cheeks, and then be like, "I'm going to the theater. I'm not interested in this negotiation." Um, but like this all kind of played into his hands in a way because he ended up getting Poland, which was kind of not even on the negotiating table at the start. I mean, ultimately, Europe was balanced in a way that prevented big power conflicts pretty much for about 100 years up until World War One, from the end of the Napoleonic times. But my point is, there is this like Russian style of negotiating. This I feel like a bit fundamentally irrational, and I've been trying to think how would I grapple with that if I were in the shoes of the negotiators who have to deal with these things. Uh, but then you also have to like kind of maybe the dark thing is it may actually not be in their interest to end the conflict, and so it's going to be really hard for you to be able to get them to stop.
Yeah,
How can you make that deal if it's not in their interest at all?
yeah. Well, this is what I meant by like Trump not really understanding the worldview, because in order to make a deal with someone, you're going to have to understand what it is that they want at the end of this and what they're ultimately looking for. And I think
Yeah,
it's really hard for us Westerners to understand how countries like Russia see the world. Like they're
I
like
think
what you
that's
said,
fair.
they're more than willing to make sacrifices that Westerners would deem as irrational. But from a, the Russian leadership perspective, it's completely rational why they might want to, sacrifice a lot of people in order to, I don't know, succeed in whatever it is that they're aiming for. I think that there is a clash of like how the two countries operate and how the people within it operate, which has lasted, hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think, which is why to this day there seems to be this contention between Europe and the West versus Russia, even though you critically say that they're historically Christian countries. I think how the people have behaved within each country has been very, very different. Um, I wouldn't say that how Russia operated in the 20th century was at all characteristic of Christian values. So even though historically they might be Christian, I think the way that Russia has changed in the 20th century, it's very far from like a Christian country.
To what extent would you view communism as an offshoot of Christianity?
Well, there on a fundamental level, like there's God's not the head of the nation or of the political regime. Like there's no overarching sort of like guiding force other than the the the
Okay,
idea that there could be sort of a utopia or a heaven on earth type thing, but that seems to be the only abstraction that they sort of say to their people.
okay, let me ask the question a different way. Do you think there would be communism without Judaism and Christianity?
Yeah, I do think so, because that's how small tribes operate, right? Is they operate with a commun. They wouldn't describe it. You wouldn't describe it as communism, but what communism essentially is that you share the resources, equally among your tribe or your community. And I think on a very local level, I think people do act in a communist way. So, for example, Ben Shapiro made this point once about how, on like a familial level, like he is a communist, because when he comes home and he brings resources to his family, he's distributing equally to his kids. Doesn't matter, you know, how old the kids are, or it's sort of each according to his needs type thing, which is and so on that local level, I think it would look like communism, and I think tribes probably have had to act those behaviors that we would recognize as being communist traits. But on a larger level, on like a sort of like nation or state level, that is, I think, completely a dysfunctional way of running a society. So that's like the first point. I think the second point is, would you get statewide communism without Christianity? I think from what we've seen historically, I think it comes from Christianity, like its roots that we've seen in the Soviet Union. Like those roots we can probably trace back to Christianity. But do I think that I, the sort of way of acting like a communist, of distributing things equally, do I think like that sort of pattern of behavior within a community can exist independent of Christianity, or not have Christian roots? And I think it also can as well, but not necessarily. I don't think we've seen any examples of that at a state level. I think the only examples that we've seen of communism existing at a state level have occurred, and have had a tradition of being coming from Christianity, in the sense that everyone is equal, the last should be first, and all those sort of like ideas, but taken to like a very, very extreme level.
Yeah, I think just to touch on the first point you're getting at, I mean, there's a quote, I forget who the quote's from, but they said, with my family, I'm a communist. With my
Yeah,
community, I'm a socialist.
yeah,
With my city, I'm a liberal. With my country, I'm a conservative. And with the world, I'm a nationalist, basically. So that's kind of capturing how you need to have like scale variance. Like it's
yeah,
got to change with, you cannot behave with the whole country the way you behave with your family. It's just not a scalable sort of idea. And look, I completely agree. I guess what I was getting at there was just saying, like, ultimately, I think the philosophy of communism emerged from Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels in kind of 1800s, Western Europe, basically, Germany and London, where they were living. Um, and I think it'd be pretty hard to say that a lot of the assumptions they made, hard to deny that a lot of the assumptions they made about what's just didn't come from the cultural milieu in which they were kind of born and raised. However, obviously, I think, you know, a huge amount of communism was in Asia where there's no such um, kind of Christian background. So you can't say that it's a prerequisite for a country to be communist. But equally, I think perhaps a reason why communism found such a strong root in East Asia was they have a more holistic view of, sort of more collective view of the population. They're kind of less concerned with individualism. They're less interested in like the individual. They're more interested in like the collective, or they don't see an individual as a discrete unit. It's a part of its environment. You kind of there's less of a barrier drawn between the person and their environment, whether or not that's the clan they're living in or their kind of hierarchy they're nested in. They're less of an, if you see what I'm getting at, they're a discrete
yeah,
thing. They're just kind of part of a greater whole. And there is some truth to that as well, right? Like, it is almost a bit of an arbitrary thing to remove yourself from your environment because ultimately you're a very complex intermediated set of feedback loops with the environment in which you're in. The food you take into your body changes you, the sunlight that hits your skin changes you, the cultural environment you find yourself in will change the way you act. It's like, where is really the boundary of, it's almost like the extended phenotype. It's like, is it a arbitrary thing to draw the boundary of an individual at their skin? Because, there may be a much greater, or like at least even the cognition going on in their brain could be something that's distributed across, I mean, at least for me, like, I find a lot of my decision making comes from conversations I have with people. Like, I talk to people about things that I'm encountering, and it's obviously my decision at the end of the day, but like, it's not. I'm not a vacuum, I'm not like kind of this discrete unit. So I think there is some merit to
Yeah,
that.
and just to add on to that, like Carl Jung developed this idea of maybe it came from Freud, but this idea of the collective unconscious, where we're all part of this big network, where we have a sort of shared psyche, not just exists on an individual level, but on a collective level, on a group level. Which and an example of how that might operate is that there would be a story told. Let's just say you're going to see a film, and the film has this particular narrative about about a hero being born, the hero defeating the villain, or perhaps the hero first being defeated or struggling with something, and then at the end of the film he comes back greater than what he was and defeats, and then he brings sort of salvation to the society or the community. He That story like that will evoke emotions or evoke some sort of response from the viewers who are watching. And you can take people from, the US, Germany, UK, who haven't seen the story before, but you'll put them in a theater, and you could probably ask them to describe what they got from the film, what takeaways, how did it make them feel, and they'll report similar things. And it's because underlying within our psyche are these sort of latent sort of neural networks that are sort of wanting to be activated when they are when they when they see some sort of stimuli like this narrative when they're in the movie theater. And so, like, to what degree are we truly a unique individual if how we respond to things are could be described as typical of human beings? Or, and no, I'm not saying that in a broader sense, and I chose those three countries deliberately because we operate under this sort of Western framework. I'm not sure if you were to show a sort of Chinese farmer the same film that they might necessarily receive it the same way. I'm not
Yeah.
sure, but uh, yeah, like this idea of collective unconscious, of that we're all part of this wider uh, playing field, is also true of human beings as well, which I find really interesting. Like, to what degree are we individuals? I think something that the West has gone too far on, and I think that we need to sort of pull back a bit, is being too individualistic and looking at people on too much of an individual level. I think that's not great. I think we need to go back towards a world where the family is the unit that should be. That's the correct size of a unit when it comes to people in society, and that would be basically be a mum, dad, and kids, and that cycle would continue. I think that's the proper unit that we should sort of look towards.
I guess 2 points there. I mean, firstly, completely agree with the Carl Jung stuff. Um, there's also a really interesting guy called Joseph Heinrich who wrote a
Mm.
book called The Weirdest People in the World, weird being Western educated, rich, industrialized, democratic. It's a book about why the West has been successful, like trying to be this big magnum opus, broad theory. One of the key principles he advances in this book is called the collective brain theory.
Okay.
And, it's really interesting because he really gets at this thing that we're talking about here, which is like, you know, what amount of that cognition is just on an individual level. And he even takes someone like Einstein with his theory of special and general relativity theories. And it's like, can you separate Einstein from the social groups he was in which they would discuss these ideas? Because ultimately the just like the key insight happened in Einstein's brain. However, this like the broader structure around that brain was a structure of several other brains all contributing to ideas that were leading in that direction. And there was actually apparently another scientist who was very close to what
Yeah,
Einstein came up with.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, I mean, like these innovations, this knowledge, it's refined, it's transmitted across many brains. And it's almost like the question then becomes like, how do you build the most effective structures of these brains to come together? The second point around community, I guess the one thing I'd quibble with there is I don't think that whilst I agree that I think family is the terminal end unit, I'm not 100% sure that's necessarily where things are broken down. I think, referring back to the quote we mentioned previously, it's like with my family, a communist, with my community, I'm a socialist. I actually think it's the second level where things are broken down. I don't think people have a community to which they belong in person anymore, kind of beyond their family. So, like the next level up, you don't have necessarily, what this used to be filled by a church or a bowling group, people who go bowling together, or some kind of place where you can kind of collectively come together and be a member of a community, help one another out. It's almost why I think Jews have been so successful is because they act out a lot of like objectively like really like weird irrational things, but this has ultimately led to like the community cohesion that has helped them stay together in societies that have often kind of rejected them, if you see what I mean. There's
yeah.
always been
But the
like
thing about the Jews is that they already have the family thing nailed down, though.
I agree there's like a stepping stone at the bottom, right? But what I'm
Yeah,
saying is I at least in my direct experience, the place where it's broken down is more that second level than and I wonder like it's something I thought I had this last week. Um how irrational like you know um do you just have to like believe a set of like really irrational things in order to accept these things or in order to like build these things up? Like if it was just so like purely rational, you can totally rationalize away any like need for like community or at least like pro atomization, right? Like you can make an economic argument that the government takes more tax when there's more earners and more discrete people. Communities ultimately could be viewed as a bad thing because one thing a community is an insurance policy, right? Where like if you break your leg, people will come and help you out. Where you actually not going to be buying as much insurance or whatever the case may be, right? Like I feel like there's a way you can rationalize away these things. But like looking at this example of like how successful Jewish communities have been across many different domains, part of the route they get to get there is by believing this like very like wacky set of things. And I almost wonder like, is that a feature, not a bug? And it probably is a feature, right? Like just having this sacred space on a Saturday where you're always a family time or like community time,
yeah. I'm
I
interested
don't
in
know.
your word choice about why you think they're irrational.
I think this. I think the set of thing, like so, for example, it's never crouched in um, like oh, this is good. We reserve Saturdays because this is a healthy thing for our family to do or for our community to do. It's God made the earth in 7 days, and He set this day aside for rest. So if you pick up your phone, you're going to hell, or whatever the case may be. It's never like the stakes are very high, or like um, the way they get there is not like through pulling it out of pop psychology, which is like, oh, this is really good for your stress levels. And Andrew Huberman thinks that spending some time with your family on the weekend will reduce your cortisol levels, um, whatever the case may be. This is kind of like the hack to get there is just like accept this very strange set of stories that will lead you to that. And I just want to like admit,
Yeah.
maybe that's part of the package.
Well, it's like if you do a thought experiment where basically there's three people and they are each wanting to plant something in their garden, and so they each plant seeds and they dig a hole, yeah, they plant seeds and they're watering it, and the first person just sort of leaves it, like lets the sun come down and it waters it. But then the second person does the same, but they're maybe after when they have dinner, they sort of like put the leftovers on top of like where the soil is because they think that it's going to give it more nutrients and it's going to grow. And then the third person says a prayer and they just pray to God that the tree is going to, or the plant is going to grow. Like, let's just like imagine we're in a completely different world, but there's still human beings. And let's just say the first person, the second person fail at this and their plants don't grow, but the third person from praying grows. And so like from that sort of like first level experiment, it's like that was so irrational that doesn't make sense why that could have grown. But then over like generations and generations and generations, it basically, they don't know why the original, but they've created this whole story of like why praying helps. But then, so you've got like 100 generations down the line, and the way to plant is you plant the seeds and then you say a prayer and then the plant grows. 100 generations later, they're going to have basically this worldview of, and they create this narrative in this story. They might be looking for reasons why praying works and why praying grows the plant, but there might be a much more objective, physical, observable reason why it does. That's not necessarily the same as like their explanation of why the plant grows when you pray, but judging from the outcome, it would be rational to pray. It sort of becomes like something that's irrational to something that actually is rational now. So, for example, in this world, if I wanted to plant, it would be actually irrational of me not to pray if I wanted my plant to grow. And so that's kind of how I'm kind of looking at it now, which is like, we know that these practices over generations and multiple generations have proven to be, but people that adopt these practices have proven to live successful lives and outcomes, not all the time, but in a lot of times. And we don't know the physical objective reason why, but what we see are the outcomes, and what we see are the fruits of their labor or the fruits of their behaviors and patterns. And so to me, it's becoming increasingly irrational not to sort of actually see where they're coming from, and to sort of almost in a way like accept that, you know what, there's probably a lot of things in the world that I don't know, that I will never truly know objectively why, but it would be irrational of me to deny them as having any sort of real world explanation why, if you know what I mean. So yeah,
I guess what you're getting at is essentially, doesn't matter if you don't know why something works for it to work. Like, do you need to know why it works to be able to exploit it? And this is actually how human beings have operated for thousands of years before we had scientific reasoning. Like, people would do things, with crop growing, for example, and they would, or even with like, not eating shellfish, or
yeah, but not even like 1,000 years past, even in our own lives when we're children, every single thing we do, we don't know why we do. And this is something that I've been exploring recently, is when you're a child and your parents tell you to do something, it's always why. So let's just say it's like 8 p.m, right? Your dad says, go to bed. And you're like, why? He says, just do it, because it's like, you just need to go to bed. There's no way he's going to sit down and explain to a kid why he should go to bed. Like, and he can give a justification, but what we've learned is that there's literally an endless trail of why questions that ultimately leads to the person who's given an answer to say, I don't know. I don't like that. That's basically the logical end of any question, of any sort of sequence of why questions. And there's lots of things that we do in our own lives that we don't know why we do, but we do. Like, why do I love my fiance? Is I could probably answer it, but if you were to really dig deeper about why I love those traits and why are those traits important to me, and why is it the case that why should I value those traits over other traits? It becomes you're now in a world where you actually can't explain and you can't say why, but it's not useful and it's not productive to dwell on those. Not sorry, it's not that it's not productive, it's that it can be productive, but if you want to have those explanations before you commit to something, then you're going to never commit to any action ever in your life. And there's always going to be a point in your life where you're going to have to make a decision on something and commit to something without knowing the full implications of what you're committing to.
I think what you're talking about is slightly in contrast to rationalism then, because this kind of sounds a little bit to me like a kind of skeptical empiricism, which is something I first learned about reading Nassim Taleb. You know, he would not call himself a rationalist. Rationalism basically saying knowledge can come independent of like kind of sensory experience. You basically, someone could just sit down and figure out the reasons for something independent of their sensory experience. Whereas an empiricist would argue that knowledge comes from your sensory input. So like, you know, just kind of like your personal kind of sensory intake of the environment is where your source of knowledge comes from. And then layering on top of that, a skeptical empiricist would be someone who layers empirical evidence on top of that, which ultimately comes from sensory input. So it's basically ultimately like valuing, you know, evidence and observation, but remaining kind of cautious and critical and open to kind of doubt about the conclusions you can draw from that evidence. I wonder if there's a branch of philosophy that specifically entails this concept, because I've also been thinking about this as well recently. Like, do I care that I know why something works or not? Like, yeah. I mean, ultimately, I'm curious about it, right? Don't get me wrong. Like, I think there is such a thing as a good explanation for things, like why they happen. And ultimately, this is the project of science, which is to explain things, like to come up with good explanations. And one of the characteristics, if you listen to David Deutsch, of a good explanation is that it's very hard to vary. Like a good explanation is invariable. You know, there's not many other explanations that can fit that kind of niche that it's trying to explain. So, I mean, there are like, and ultimately, like, just because the way I'm built, I'm, you know, quite scientifically minded. I'm curious about like why things work, just in general. Like, I know I love to like inspect like mechanical structures to try and piece together how they work or why they were designed in a certain way. I'm ultimately curious about the brain. I'm ultimately curious about, I am curious about why, you know, and that I don't know at the nested I don't know at the bottom of everything, I find quite frustrating because I'm like, well, there has to be a good explanation. Ultimately, I fundamentally believe the world is explicable. Like, and the lack of an explanation right now just means that we haven't got around to figuring that out yet. It's not that it's fundamentally unknowable. I also believe that human beings are capable of understanding anything. Like, there's nothing that's beyond the reach of our understanding, because ultimately we're universal. You know, we're kind of a universal computer in the same way that you know, your computer is too, or a Turing machine is. Like, so and in a way, you know, this is part of what makes human beings so special. We're special in the sense that we are different from everything else in nature because we have the capacity to explain things and we have the capacity to understand anything, whereas a dog will never get there. A dog is essentially a preset bunch of genetic programs that are executing on an animal.
By special, do you mean better?
And
by better, I mean worth more.
what I'm getting at is like I'm against this like kind of um Stephen Hawking view that like human beings are just like a chemical reaction on an unimpressive planet, or by an unimpressive star. Like I think that's fundamentally wrong. There is like something different about us, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other things that can exhibit the same characteristics that make us special too. Like there could also be aliens that become universal explainers, as Deutsch would put it, like um, with a capacity to understand anything. There could be computers that could become universal explainers with a capacity to understand and explain anything. So, like, whilst it does make us special and contrast us with everything else that we know about in the universe, it doesn't. It's not like exclusive to humans. Like other things could take on those characteristics that define us in contrast to the rest of nature. If you see what I mean.
I think what this is making me think of is basically higher order questioning. So, for example, using the tank example that you said about why a tank works, there's a sort of very like first order explanation about the mechanism within the tank, about how it all works and fits together. And for example, like all the sort of cogs and the I don't know, maybe how the engine works or how the wheels work and how are the wheels able to roll in mud and things like that. But then there's this, I don't even know, number, nth order explanation about why does a tank work? Well, a tank works because Britain wanted to help save Belgium from being invaded by Germany. That's also a sort of higher order level of explanation, because if you ask why all these things about the mechanisms of the tank work, you're going to get to a point. Well, Britain were involved in World War One, and then they developed the tank, and then why did they do that? And then you're going to get to basically, you're going to go all the way back to basically the German Empire, and then you're going to go back to Bismarck, and then you're going to go back to the Franco-Prussian War, and then you're going to go back to the Napoleonic Wars, and then you're going to go back to the idea of nationalism, and then like there's basically all these questions, and it does all lead back to ultimately why is the world here, and why is there something rather than nothing? I think is like basically the deepest question about why anything exists at all. And the nature about higher order level explanations is that it requires the explanation to be outside of the realm of the thing that it's describing. So, for example, you can't describe why water moves the way it does by using water. Basically, you have to go like a different level. You have to go beyond the realm of H2O and speak about chemicals, or speak about how atoms interact with each other. And I increasingly have been like meditating on this recently about how if you any explanation about why the world or universe exists, that explanation ultimately has to be unknowable to us humans because we're in the universe. And when you ask a scientist, and I've seen Richard Dawkins give this explanation many times about why did the Big Bang happen, and I'm not making a value judgment on this, but he does dismiss it and says that's a non-question. That's like, you can't ask that question. You can't ask what happened before the Big Bang because time started at the Big Bang. So you can't.
What do you mean by why?
Well, what I mean by why is like how is like that same question about why does a tank work or how does a tank work is, and you can sort of describe the physics and the mechanics about how it works. But so maybe I don't mean why, maybe I mean how. But if you're asked how does a universe exist, the explanation for that can't come from within the universe. Just by definition, like that, the explanation has to come from a realm that's able to sort of look inwards at the universe.
But I mean, I don't want to get into kind of the physics of it because I kind of was tracking you a little bit there, but then the concept of outside the universe.
Yeah, I knew where you were going with the why thing, which is kind of why I did change it to how, because like as a common argument as well, is that you like why are you presupposing that there has to be a why, basically?
Well, yes, but also they're completely overdetermined. Like, why questions are this kind of a Peter Thiel thing, but it's like they're very overdetermined. There's just there's so many different explanations for why questions. It's very hard to get at exactly why something is the case.
But it's just
And
that every single thing in the world, right, has a why. So I just don't
why is a
understand.
very
I just don't understand why you can't ask why about the universe itself. And a lot of scientists basically play this uh, sort of like logical or like linguistic game where it's like, well, why do you think that there's a why? And it's like there's no basis, there's no rational basis for wanting to ask why about the universe, and they sort of equate it to a sort of absurd question like, what is the color of guilt type things, like why does guilt have to have a color type thing. It's like they're saying it's a sort of question like that, or what is the sound of black,
it depends what you mean by why as well, right? Like if you're asking for like a meaning, then I just don't think it's a very good question. Like, why does the universe exist? Like, why would someone do this? Like, or what is the meaning of the universe existing? Versus like, I think the set of things that led to the universe kind of coming into existence. I do think, and again, I think this is just the nature of problem solving anyways, right? Where like problem solving doesn't have an end. Like there's no bottom to problem solving. Every time you solve a problem, there's two more problems that come out of it, or maybe more, because you figured something out, but that's led you to understand that there's actually more you don't know beneath that problem. And there's no end to this, right? This is like an infinite regress. You solve more and more problems with more and more explanations, but there's no end point to that. You always have more and more to explain.
But that doesn't that contradict what you said earlier about everything being ultimately knowable by humans?
Yes, no. So what I meant by that is like there's nothing we can't understand. There's no kind of there's no like set of facts that because of the way we're constructed, we fundamentally cannot understand.
No, but I think, but mathematically, if you create a class or a set, and within each set is a problem, you can sort of categorize that sequence of problems as a set of questions. And what you've just said is that set of questions would ultimately be unknowable and uninterpretable by humans.
No, I don't think it'd be uninterpretable. I just think though you would get to the next question and you have to solve that question, but that question is fundamentally understandable. Then that would pose two more questions, both of which the answers to which would be understandable. I'm just saying that it would.
But that's operating within the set. But that's operating within the set. If let's just say you've got basically like all these questions, which yes, I agree. Like you could probably, each one is intelligible and you could probably understand each one. But if you were to like step back and say, right, let's create the set of all questions, that whole set of questions would actually be, when you're looking at it from the outside, would be unintelligible.
I'm not saying that any individual can know all the answers to all the questions.
Yeah.
I'm just saying there's nothing fundamentally ununderstandable about the answers to any individual question.
Yeah. But but the realm of like of spiritual thinking and philosophizing doesn't deal with those specific questions that the sort of layman can read up on it and then understand. I think the idea of religion and people being spiritual is trying to look at the set of questions that I'm talking about, which is the set of all these questions, which is why why or how do these questions come about? How are we in a position where we're asking these questions, where we can see things, where we can I agree with your points on like a sort of like a local sort of granular level looking at these questions. But if you were to step back and look at the set of all questions, that no one person can have the ultimate answer to everything. And I think that's what humans are sort of really striving for is to through every single generation, they're making incremental steps towards an explanation about what the universe is made of and things like that. But what the science isn't doing is describing why. And what I think I'm puzzled with is why you can't ask why, and why the the universe existing can't be met with a why question.
What does progress on the why question look like to you?
What is progress on the why question? Um, I think it's becoming unified to the universe, becoming one with it, becoming understanding the laws of nature. But and by understanding, I mean acting it out. So, for example, a very basic, simple example is do not lie. So, not lying. And I think that telling the truth and speaking the truth is a way of harmonizing yourself with the law of nature, with the way the universe is set up to be. So, for example, if I see something happen and I'm living about my life and someone asks me, what was that thing that happened? I would be corrupting the world and sort of twisting it in a way that I could say, like, I could say to this person that something happened that didn't happen, and they would live their life as if what I said was true, let's just say. And then maybe they tell people, you've sort of created these two narratives that eventually is going to come, the world is going to snap back, and you're going to eventually feel the blowback of that lie that you told maybe like 10 years ago. But the world doesn't, the world has a natural order. The world has a sort of consistency, the laws of physics that are, and the reason why there are laws and the reason why we know science works is because you're able to predict outcomes with what we've discovered. And so telling the truth, you can, you're able to sort of predict the nature of the world in a such a existential sense, where you know that if you have if you don't have a sort of lying bone inside you, and all you can do is say the truth, then you and you believe that this is the way of the universe. I think there's a sort of comfort and solace in that, and there's a sort of deep meaning that you have where you feel so connected and in tune with the way the world works that is ultimately unshakable, that can't be sort of like bulldozed down, that it gives you a sort of weird sort of strength that the most physical person, the most physically strong person in the world wouldn't have. The weakest sort of skinniest person who has this deep found connection with the world and wants to and doesn't see things in a way that can be corruptible is, I think that's a good example of understanding the why is. And because I think living with that sort of operating system gives you meaning in life. It gives you your why. Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear almost any how. And I think you've got to figure out your ultimate why in life, and that can be basically through truth and understanding the sort of patterns of the world. And if you're able to really tune into what that is, anything that life throws at you, like what I was saying, you'll be able to bear it and you'll be able to take it on. And I think that's a fundamental law of the way the world works that even animals operate under, because they don't lie, but they can deceive, but it's different from lying, I think.
I was going to say, like,
Yeah,
what do you think about like a stick
yeah,
insect or
yeah.
a leaf-tailed gecko?
I think deception is different from lying, but I think only humans can lie. So yeah, I think this is why we've got such a burden on us because every single human nature has this capability of saying, no, I didn't eat the last sweet, when they know they did. And it's so easy for all of us to just say, no, I didn't do that thing when you did. And and for me, it's become so obvious recently that I am full of these uh faults, I guess, like of where I'm so desperately want to say not own up to something, or hide away from things that maybe that I shouldn't have done, or to maybe say things that I should say, and I decide not to say them for some reason. And that example of that I gave about the person not saying, about telling a lie and then ultimately it coming back to snap you, I think there's nowhere that that's written down in the world. I think a lot of people intuitively have this idea that what goes around comes around, or this idea of karma, from India, or this idea that everything happens for a reason, that there are consequences to actions, or there are two seemingly unconnected things actually have a link to them, that we aren't able, that isn't intelligible, that isn't ultimately understandable why those two things are connected. But if you put your faith, or if you have faith that that is a truism of the world, that that is actually how the world works, that these things actually come back to bite you, the wrong things that you're doing, then I think that that's your one step towards knowing why the universe is here.
But why do you need faith if you just kind of gave a very lengthy explanation as to why that's
Yeah,
the
because
case?
the start of what we were discussing about was about being able to rationalize behavior. And I think it is rational. So it's not necessarily, it's rational to an extent. It depends on what level you look at it. And I think being a 21st century human really does us a disservice, or it really hinders our ability to have faith in these laws, in these natural laws, because even though I was able to explain to you about why it's important to tell the truth, it doesn't stop me from being confronted by a situation where someone asks, "Hey Sam, uh did you eat the last sweet?" And I did, but I don't want to own up to it. And even though I know all these consequences, it doesn't stop me from thinking, "Oh well, this time I'll get away with it," or um actually I can't logically map the steps of how I'm going to get cut from this situation. And so therefore maybe I should just lie and say that it wasn't me. And 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 because I'm a 21st century human, it's, if I don't have the explanation easily in front of me and I'm able to articulate each step, then it becomes very hard for me to sort of have faith in the outcome, that or have faith that I shouldn't lie. But yeah, so that's
So
why there's this
if
contention in it.
if I understand you correctly, basically what you're saying is there is this resonance one can feel of kind of an interconnectedness with the universe, almost like I was talking about earlier, like being 100% identified as being a part of the universe as opposed to being kind of distinct from it. Like you're like embedded within the structure of the universe and you feel connected to nature, not just nature, but like, you don't feel like there's a distance between you and the world. It's like you are a part of the world.
Well, you're a reflection of the world, the same way that a lot of biologists can look at an animal and tell you exactly the habitat of that animal just from looking at the animal's surface, just
Yeah,
because
exactly.
they,
Or
they
like
they're modeled after the environment, they reflect it.
like how a leaf could be designed to conserve water if it's from the desert, or whatever,
Yeah,
like so and but what I would argue, not argue, but we kind of you just kind of want to delve a bit deeper into
yeah,
is like, okay, so one aspect of this for you is telling the truth.
yeah.
Otherwise, it's really hard to be in this connection with the world if what you're doing is fundamentally at odds with what you see to be the kind of um, core mechanical nature of this universe.
Okay.
There are there like other, so obviously like just telling the truth is just one facet of a bigger set of things we're talking about here. Like there surely are loads of different ways to get at this sensation, right? Like For
Yeah.
example, this is something people talk a lot about with psychedelics, that they will take some psychedelics and they will feel this like kind of distance between them and the world drop. This distance closes to zero, and it's almost like a shortcut to that feeling,
Hmm.
that kind of spiritual experience. Or like kind of Buddhist meditation practice, mindfulness, where you're kind of just being very mindful of, you know, you're just being very mindful of this connection between yourself and the world, or you're kind of stopping yourself from being distracted from that fundamental state of being, which is a part of the universe. You're not kind of caught up in these like chains of thought that are saying, you know, why do you not have a car or whatever? It's like, no, no, you are coming back to that central insight, which is in the present moment, you're a part of and this reflection of the universe. Do you have like a quibble with like the different ways of getting to that state or like that insight? Or are you kind of universalist in the sense that like the insight itself is what's fundamentally important to feel like a fulfilled life?
Yeah. I think I do have a quibble with it actually.
I
I'll
do
say
actually.
two things. The first thing is when you're talking about psychedelic experiences, I have um, listened to a lot of people debate this, and I basically left away with this quote from Carl Jung that where he says, "Beware of unearned wisdom," and that basically, like when I heard that, I was like, "Whoa!" Like I kind of intuitively have an idea of what that means, but I really wanted to like sort of go deeper in it, and it's basically the psychedelic route, yet fast track route to connecting with the universe, but to someone who hasn't gone through life experiences to put the wisdom or their experiences of the psychedelics into proper day-to-day context of how the world works, I think is going to be a struggle for them to actually be able to integrate that knowledge into their life. And I can give a sort of real life example of this. So I'm actually currently setting up two friends who are going on a date. I've got a friend from work, and actually, yeah, it's both friends from work, and but they don't really know each other. And so I said to the guy, look, I've got this friend. She's a really cool girl. I think you'll really get on with her. And I said some similar things to the girl, and I chat to them independently. They don't know each other. And I said, and the girl was asking me questions, and she was like, "Oh, what's he like? What does he do?" and things like that. And I would say, "Oh, he's like this. He's like that. He's like this." And then the guy as well. What is she like? What does she do? And they want to know these things. And it got to the point where I was like in the middle of this conversation with the guy, and I was just thinking, like you're going to go into this date with all these sort of not even like, well, you're going to create like preconceptions from what I'm saying, but like I'm not giving her the opportunity to actually reveal these things to you in a way that you've earned it. Like you're taking the easy way. You're asking me, Sam, what is she like? What interests her? What topics should I stay away from? What are there any sort of personal traumas in her life that I should know about that I should bring up in the date? And I just had this again, this quote, beware of unearned wisdom. And I said this to him. I said, look, you don't want to go into the date knowing all these things, because I actually think that
The process of
it,
discovery is the
not, yeah, but not only that, but like this, but you knowing these things is actually going to do you much more of a disservice than it is an advantage, because you're going to ask her questions that are going to be so weird for her to receive, because in your head you think you know her already, and so you're going to basically approach the date in a very unorthodox way, and her similarly as well. And I think that's a good example of what I'm of how the psychedelic route can actually be a disadvantage in life, that you can feel like you've connected with the world in a way, and you say, okay, I know. Another example of this is like you can read so many books on relationships and things, or let's just say you're a Christian and you know that everyone operates in sin, like with some sort of inherent sin, and that no one is perfect, and you have an argument with your spouse, and the first thing you say to them is like, look, we're all faulty here. Like we're all faulty. I know that I did wrong, but you weren't perfect in the situation as well. And then they're like, well, how was I not perfect? And you're like, well, I'm just taking it, as gospel that you're not perfect. So I'm even though I'm not able to pinpoint the ways that you screwed up, I think it would be helpful for me if you really look deeper into yourself, and like it's just not productive to go down there. You're sort of using a wisdom that you've learned from somewhere that someone hasn't been able to put into context for you. You've sort of just got like a first hand interpretation of like what this text means, and then you're sort of looking at things in life to apply it to. And I think the mature way to approach wisdom or to approach knowledge is to take it on board, and through your day-to-day life experiences, it will slowly be to reveal to you when you should and shouldn't apply these things. And how you'll know that is because you'll go through situations where you need to have some sort of introspection, and you think, oh, that thing that I read, this makes sense now because I've gone through that life experience. So the psychedelics are good because it's something that you can put in your in your sort of like in your chest or in your sort of like backpack when you're going through life and you're going through a journey, and you'll be confronted with something that really takes you back to that moment, and you're able to put two and two together, and it can be a revelation experience for you. But I don't think the experience itself should be taken as the ultimate revelation of the universe. I think it has to come hand in hand with a practical experience.
I completely agree, but the way I think then is the appropriate way to interpret the psychedelic experience is this is a shortcut to what is possible through like years of hard work. You can kind of get a glimpse of what it's like to be in that end state, this kind of like interconnectedness. And it's kind of like, oh, this is what I'm aiming for, if you know what I mean. And in that way, it can make the journey there a lot easier because there's actually something at the end of that road that's worth trying to achieve.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean.
No, I agree with you.
So, the interesting thing about psychedelics is that there's nothing that happens to your brain in a psychedelic experience that you cannot get to completely without drugs. Like this is literally just happening in your head, right? So there's nothing as this is kind of a component, which is kind of the crazy thing to hear. The auditory hallucinations, the visual hallucinations. I mean, if those visual hallucinations were happening to you just normally, you would call yourself a schizophrenic. But obviously because it's in this controlled situation of a psychedelic experience, then it's going to fade away. It's not going to be permanent.
Yeah.
So
I think I completely agree with you. I think how I first interpreted the psychedelic example was not that way that you described, because I do agree with that. I think there's this other way that it can be seen that you've got some sort of knowledge that's just sort of revealed to you, and that ultimately knowing can be a barrier to learning. So if you feel like you know something, you're searching on something, then that's going to be a barrier to you actually wanting to find out more and find out for yourself. And I think there's multiple like times in life where someone tells you something and you're like, oh, that's, but you don't do your own discovery and you don't learn, about like from like asking and like inquiring into the world. And I think sometimes like I
completely agree.
Yeah,
like the process is the valuable part, right? Like everyone wants to be like, not everyone, but like a lot of people want to be like a big time entrepreneur, but they don't want to go through the brutal grind that it would take to get there, the many failed experiments. But ultimately what has made whoever you want to talk about a successful entrepreneur is the learnings, it's more the learnings they've taken from the failures than it is the success of that individual experiment.
Yeah.
If you see what I mean. And there's, you can obviously learn from other people as well. But there's just, and this is what I think is maybe both an advantage and disadvantage. Like in one sense, like people have become too, it's like sweeping generalizations in general. But like people they have way less of a bias towards action. Like I think people underestimate their ability to just do something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's this is something we've talked about, like a problem with the UK as well. Like our culture is like very much like, let's talk about it, but it's not like, okay, let's do it first and then talk about it. It's like, let's talk about it and then never do it.
Yeah, yeah.
But ultimately, like the informational feedback from reality of trying something is the valuable thing, right? It's even more valuable than the talking about it. So, and this is something I think it can be an advantage, because if everyone, like, there's this concept I've been playing around with, and we're kind of shifting this topic here a little bit, but this idea of like how average is over, and how this economist Tyler Cowen wrote this book. I haven't read the whole book, but I kind of understand the thesis, which is basically um, because these like insanely high leverage technologies are getting dumped on humanity, there's going to be basically, instead of like a large cluster around the mean, there's going to be people who can use these tools insanely productively and just like basically like outstripping everyone else. And the people who don't really like are not interested, or like mentally incapable, or just not interested to use these things, and they will be kind of like this proletariat that is perpetually kind of stuck basically until they can learn how to do these things. But just because the the returns to scale are so high and the positive feedback loop is so strong, people who end up kind of like leveraging these things will end up so far like from the standard deviation of the mean that there is almost not going to be any space left in the middle, and it's going to be like, so there's not going to be any kind of so-called average person left, as it were. There's just going to be the exceptional and then the not exceptional. And I think this is one of those things where it's like, in a way, like as Gen Z, we have it quite tough, where it's like, to link back to the theme of the podcast, we're exposed to a level of global competition that has never been the case throughout all of history. Like, it's never been the case that to the degree that it is now, that you have to compete with university spots in your country with people internationally, and to the degree that you have to now, for example, or for jobs, or for housing, or for whatever. Like, it's just, things are so wide open that you're just like competing with a way bigger set of people. But at the same time, there's so many people in our generation that just scroll on their phones the whole day. So it's almost like, my AirPods are about to die, and might shift. That it's like almost like there's so many people within our generation that we're competing with that are actually just checked out of the competition entirely. So in a way, it's like we got it quite well, like quite good, but at the same time, it's also really tough. So I kind of take this as a positive way. I'm like, most people are not trying things. Most people are just like scrolling. Most people aren't like kind of interested or fascinated or curious. And I actually view that as an incredibly bullish thing, where it's like, if you just do something every day, or you kind of just build something, or like kind of have the mentality of trying to drive towards something, that is in and of itself the special thing. Like, and there's so many people who you're already out competing by doing that.
Do you think it's valuable to compare yourself to other people like that?
It's not a point of comparison, it's just a point of competition. It's if you're in like a broad global competition for resources, it's worth understanding the competition, right? Like, if you're a business
on an individual level, why would an individual who's thinking about like themselves look at the world from a competitive lens?
I think, again, because you're in the environment that you're in, right? And to try to divorce yourself from that too much will kind of lead you to not behaving, or to being less, I guess, productive, or have a mismatched view of what the reality of the underlying situation fundamentally is. Like, a business is very aware of who their competitors are.
Mm-hmm.
What they do with that information is up to the business. And ultimately, like, there's better or worse strategies for dealing with competition, like just trying to copy them, or just out innovate them, or whatever. Like, the positive and negatives to that, it depends how commoditized the business is.
No, but I completely agree on a business level or on a community level. But my question was originally on a individual level. Is it right that we see the world you know, through a competitive lens?
I think it depends on how. So things become competitive when resources are scarce, right? When there's such an like an abundance of resources, then it's just less competitive, if you see what I mean. But ultimately, you are like in competition with people for the next job you're applying for, right? You are in
Mm-hmm.
competition with people for the house you want to buy. Like that's why you have a bidding war. Um, and so I don't think it's completely, yeah, I think it's a fairly useful um, framework.
But when you're applying for a job, what's like are you primarily thinking of the competition, or are you primarily thinking about, you know, why that job's good for you, why you might be good for it, why what skills do you have that are good for the job? Like, I don't see myself
No,
thinking at all about the competition.
but if I don't get the job, I'm like, why did I not get the job? What was it about other candidates that led to them getting the job and not me? If you see what I mean?
Yeah,
Because that's like a directional signal from reality of something you may need to improve.
yeah, but I think that's sort of like comparison rather than like competition. I say, like, when you're competing with someone, you're wanting to uh
Competition
yeah,
is
it's like a
super.
fight for resources. It's like a fight, almost. It's like a battle. It's like they're it's like winner takes all type thing, zero sum game. That's how I think of competition.
You can have a positive sum competition. It's not necessarily zero sum.
Yeah.
For example, I wonder like I don't have this, but like I wonder if it's like almost like a worthwhile thing to like find a nemesis, like somebody you're like, this is my sworn enemy, and I'm gonna do everything I can to outstrip this person. Like in the same way that like war is a clearing function for all the like breaks and barriers we put on ourselves. Like
Yeah.
for example, like building critical national infrastructure. Like if we were at war with the Netherlands and we needed to build power lines from one place to another, and the fate of the war depended on us being able to build those power lines, there's no ways we would continue to care about what the local opposition group from Berwick on Tweed thought
Mm.
about, the aesthetic value of those power lines.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So in a way, there's like everything, like there's all these like insane benefits to war, obviously aside from the mass killing and like horrendous experiences, right? But there is this like kind of clearing function where you like actually have to like really take stock of what's really valuable or what really matters. And I think in a way competition can do this too, where you're like, okay, well this is like a serious struggle that I'm in. This is not flippant. It's like you can almost use that as a
Yeah. Well, this is sort of Nassim Taleb's idea of anti-fragility, isn't it? Like, this is it in a nutshell, I think. Like, and ultimately, like, the original person who came up with the idea of anti-fragile was Nietzsche, when he said, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And it's that any clash with an adversary or friction with something actually leads to more growth rather than the destruction, or the sort of disintegration of those two things. And I think when you said that everyone in life needs someone like that, I think I completely agree with you. But it's not that everyone needs a nemesis. It's that everyone needs a helpful adversary that's going to embolden them. And in the book of Genesis, Eve, her name means helpful adversary. That's what woman means. And that's why God created Eve, was because Adam needed someone that he could bounce ideas off, that he could be corrected when he's going astray, and he could do the same for her. And for me, that's an amazing metaphor for what we need in our lives, is to be bounded to someone, and bounded so tightly with that person that there's this deep trust and bond between you both, so much so that you can tell the other person, like, you're not going to want to hear this, but there's this thing that you're doing which is really not great. I think not just for us, but I think it's something that you need to resolve and fix. And I think ultimately we'll be better off if you fixed it. And that happens both ways. And the other person is not going to take you seriously, or might, if you weren't bounded by marriage or by something that's an authority external to you, then why should you listen to that person? Because you can just say, well, like, I don't want to take criticism, like, that's a see you later, or it's not my place to tell this person. But no, if you are actually bound to the person who's going to give you that constructive criticism, then you are going to grow by definition, because that's what humans are ultimately, is are anti-fragile beings. And we know that just from the skin of our hands when we're at the gym and we're weightlifting, and your skin hardens and it's able to deal with, tougher grips. It's down to our organs when they're
a feature of nature.
It's a thing of nature, exactly. And it gets battle hardened. And I think that's what life is about ultimately. And I agree with your point. We all need to have a helpful adversary in our lives. And I really feel sorry for, single people that, and I guess if we want, we can relate this back to our Gen Z, the theme of our podcast, which is we're seeing increasing amounts of Gen Z being single and not being in long-term relationships. And that's sad, because I think of each person that isn't getting told this is the thing that you need to fix, or you would be, more fulfilled if you had this. And not everyone needs to be told. I mean, I think everyone has to be told, or has to be critiqued, and has to be shaped by the environment that they're in. But I think a lot of people run away from that as well. And I think that's why people are afraid to maybe commit to themselves into deep relationships, because how do I trust this person is gonna, but just how do I know I can trust this person? And then B is, okay, assuming I trust this person, how do I know that they have my best interests at heart? C is, if they do have my best interests at heart, how do I know that what they're saying to me is correct and accurate? And C, if I know what they're saying is correct and accurate, how do I know that I'm able to take action on the things that they're saying? And there's all these sort of unknowns, basically. And ultimately, that's why you need that bond and that sort of those vows that you make with each other, which is like, no matter what happens, we're not going to leave each other. I'm going to tell you the truth, and I'm going to tell you. And again, this sort of harkens back to my point that I made earlier about telling the truth, about being at one with reality. But yeah, that's just my sort of 2 pence on your idea of finding a helpful nemesis. Yeah.
There's this idea from that Nassim Taleb also made me aware of, that's on this vein of anti-fragility, which is, as opposed to saying like PTSD, post-traumatic distress,
Yeah.
there's actually also something called post-traumatic growth,
Okay.
which is a traumatic experience contributing to, it's in a way like the same metaphor as the calluses forming on your hand.
Yeah.
Like, in what ways could a traumatic experience lead to the formation of stronger character or
Yeah.
resilience or the capacity to deal with tough situations?
Yeah.
Almost nobody is capable of dealing with a really tough situation out of nowhere. Like, the most resilient people are people who have been through really tough things and come out the other side, and have like kind of weathered that storm and kind of found it in like what it is it in themselves that they need to draw on to kind of weather that storm. And so I completely agree with you there.
What's so fascinating as well is about the fact that not everyone, but if you ask people who have gone through traumatic situations and that have grown as a result of it, and you ask them, like, do you regret going through that? They'll say, look, I regret that that situation happened, but I'm not ashamed, or I don't regret the person that I am because of it. And if you were to ask them, would you like to go back to that person who you were before that experience? They're like, no, the experience is something that's made them who they were.
Well, it also depends a little bit on the experience, right? Because some things are just so bad. It's almost like the point of anti-fragility is that it makes you more like robust to like variable shocks.
Yeah,
But there's not like a shock that's so bad that nobody couldn't survive it, basically. Like, so obviously, let's say you take a tree and you let it blow in the wind, and part of what makes a tree strong is the wind.
yeah,
It's its response to like blowing, and it creates what's called lignin, which is a chemical that kind of makes it more solid. And so in a
yeah,
way, if you grow, the tree needs the wind to become
yeah,
resilient.
yeah.
But there is some speed of wind that will uproot the tree no matter how resilient it's become,
Yeah,
right? And so the question is like, how do you stay in the slot basically of
yeah.
um, experience that kind of will push you forward and
Well,
not
I
kind
guess
of
like the answer to that specific thing surely is like a sort of Darwinian response, which is, well, provided that tree wasn't able to sow its seed, like just trees that aren't able to produce those chemicals will just not be in the next generation of trees in that forest.
no true. I'm just saying that you want it that there is some degree of trauma that's so bad that it's not recoverable from, right?
Uh, I think I don't. I think no, but that's just a faith. I don't actually have a, a a sort of rational, objective reason why. But I think with
But it also
with
depends on the
a
person, right? Like
I think with an
how
interpretive framework, you can rationalize, or you can put every sort of context or any trauma into context that can ultimately be redeemed and salvaged, and you that and it can ultimately be for the benefit of humankind. I think no matter how severe the trauma is. So, for example, Auschwitz, for example, that is obviously something deeply, deeply traumatic. But then there were literally Auschwitz prisoners who were able to and I'm reading Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl at the moment, and that is a story about he went through the concentration camps and he, you know, experienced the depths of hell there, but for some reason still found a way to be salvaged by the whole experience, and he found a greater sense of meaning through it. And he had a particular framework of life where he was able to sort of slot in his experiences and sort of make sense of them in that way. And from what I've learned from psychoanalysts is that when they're talking to trauma patients, one way that helps the patient is actually to think about their experience from a third person perspective. So instead of saying I went through this and I experienced this, you say no, you step out and you try and put what's happened into context, and you say no, okay, this person was walking down the street and this person was approached by men, if it was like, I don't know, whatever the situation is, and this person was harmed by men. And when you start to see it when you start to remove yourself from the situation and you can put it into that sort of context, a lot of that helps the patient actually recover from the trauma. So I think every single experience in life is you're able to put some sort of you're able to reframe it in a way that is positive. But I do agree that there are some people that have some experiences where that is an almost impossible feat. But I think I would, but I'm not pessimistic enough to say that it's impossible for it to be salvaged.
And then why do mental institutions exist? Because
Because it's tough. It's
but I
tough.
think
I'm not
I
saying it's
just think
easy.
there are I just think by definition there are some set of experiences because you've got this whole landscape of things, right? That could possibly happen to you. There are just some set of experiences that could happen to some people that are just not recoverable from. They're fundamentally altered in such a way by that experience. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, that they can't kind of come back. I don't think it's very helpful to have that discussion, anyways. But I'm just saying, like, maybe have a much darker psyche than you do because I can imagine sets of things that could happen to someone that would be just like fundamentally irrecoverable from, just like,
Yeah, no, I agree, but I
like,
think
do you think like Joseph Fritzl's kid could ever recover, from that experience?
um, depends what you mean by recover. I think can if you're asking,
There's no way to like recast, like, for me, like the stuff that's happened to me in my life that has like led to me growing and stuff I can quite easily be like, okay, well, look, that was an emotionally very tough experience,
yeah,
but ultimately I'm a much more mature person for
yeah,
having been through that. And so you can kind of play this game of like recasting these things or kind of reframing these things in a positive way. It's
yeah,
obviously hard to do that in the moment because you're kind of going through it, but like this is how you should really, you know, the obstacle is the way, as the Stoics would say. Like doing the thing is what leads to the growth in and of itself. But there are, I think, I do think that there are just, and again, I'm so grateful that none of this has ever happened to me in my life, even though I've been
yeah.
through some tough experiences. And ultimately, these things are all relative. I'm sure there's people have been through tougher, but I haven't been through anything that's so tough that I will just forever be like
Yeah.
irredeemably mentally ill as a consequence of having gone through that. You know,
I think I agree with you. I think I'm looking at things perhaps too abstractly. I think humans are limited in terms of their experiences in life. And so I think that it's, if you go through, for example, what um, the children of Joseph Fritzl went through, that I think in their lifetime and in the average human lifetime, it is let's just say impossible for argument's sake for them to be able to recover through that. I think hypothetically, if a human could live a lifetime, do you think that, sorry, could live an infinite amount of time? Do I think it's impossible ever for humans, for a human being who's gone through something like that to recover from it? We don't know because humans don't only live a maximum of like what 100 years or something. So I think yes, it is impossible in the physical world. Do I think everything is ultimately impossible to be recovered? No, but I think because we are limited human beings, I think it's good enough to say it's impossible, practically speaking.
yeah. Well, look, we can't wrap this conversation up on irredeemably irreconcilable trauma. Is there anything else you'd like to touch on before we go?
Yeah. I just want to say this story because we've talked a lot about truth. We talked a lot about um, introspection and finding meaning in the world and things. And before we started this conversation, I had in mind to speak about a story that's happened to me recently that has made me think really deeply about these things. Basically, I spent the last 3.5 years at my company, and I'm finally leaving because I found a new opportunity to do
Notice the choice
something
of words there.
exciting.
Finally.
Yeah. Um, Finally, the reason why I said finally is because over the last 3.5 years, there have been experiences at work that have troubled me, and I've found personally challenging to make sense of them. But what's been more challenging for me is actually raising my concerns. I think I see other people that are able to share their concerns and to talk about quibbles that they have with how things are uh, governed and processes etc at work, but I've always struggled with that, and I've always sort of bottled it up inside, and I share it obviously when I come home. So my fiance, my partner, she's obviously aware of a lot that troubles me, and I think that's one remedy to a problem that requires several things actually. So I was able to get through my 3.5 years by speaking about it with my friends like yourself and with my partner, but it didn't solve the issue though. And over time, I started getting increasingly more um, frustrated, I'd say, and to the point where I would tell other people at work that weren't even involved in the situations about what I was going through. And I would, so for example, maybe my close friends and colleagues, that were close to me, and I'd say, oh, I'm really struggling with this. And then they'd say, yeah, me too. I've noticed that too. And then you'd find, oh, no way, you're also experiencing this. And we talk about it, and then just basically like 3.5 years passed where this slowly is building up, and you've sort of created this whole ecosystem of gossip and um, disparaging comments about managers and about processes at work, and maybe about like the way things are done in the company. And they it basically got to 3.5 years later, and I'm now leaving the company, and all these managers are saying to me, hey Sam, like, sorry to hear you go, do you want to stay? I'm like, well, I've got this other great opportunity, and there's also, reasons why I don't feel like I can stay, why I kind of feel like it's right for me to like not be here. And they're like, why? And I sort of slowly give them a little bit of what's been going through my mind, to the point where I've said a little bit about it to like many managers about, like, and I sort of like given like a sort of a facet of like what the issue is, but there's not been one person that I've sort of laid it all down about everything that's been going through my head. And I started getting increasingly depressed, and it was affecting my mental health a lot the last 2 weeks going into work, because I'm now going into work thinking, oh, what have people told people about what I've said? And what not only that, but now that I'm leaving, all the close colleagues that I felt like I had don't see any reason to have any continued loyalty to me anymore. Why would they? People, it's not often that people stay connected to their colleagues when they move to a job. And so all these things were going through my head, and I started getting insanely depressed, and it was a heavy burden, where I would go into work and then I would leave even less of a man, because I'm experiencing more problems, and I feel like even less like I'm able to say them. And it became so difficult that I said, you know what, I'm just so done. Like, everyone's asking for all this, all my thoughts on the matter, because I'm leaving, and they want all this negative things, because no one really speaks, no one says the truth at work, no one is honest with their opinions, no one is no one, I don't feel like anyone is really truly empowered to truly speak their mind at work. And I felt like it was my responsibility that before I leave, I'm going to tell some people, my thoughts. But then what I found myself being able to do was having to, be very professional in how I say it, and make sure it's not coming across as a personal opinion, but actually as a sort of objective thing, that not just me that putting forward, but it's coming, it's been sort of, it's an idea that's been shared amongst many, and I'm trying to put this forward so that it can be a cause for change in the most sort of thoughtful way possible. But even doing that is not getting at the heart of the matter, and I still feel myself being very uneasy in myself, because I'm not able to speak the truth how I want to. And the reasons for that, because obviously I care about my reputation, I care about not burning bridges, I care about all these things. So striking that balance between being completely honest and also being self-interested, and like wanting to think about my longevity in the workforce, really was a very tough balancing act. And anyway, so it affected my mental health so much that after like one of the last conversations I had with one of the managers, where I was basically very critical of things, that really hurt me, I guess, like internally and like mental health wise. I just felt like I'm just this bundle of negative energy now. Like I've not really had an opportunity to say anything positive to anyone, really, because they've all been trying to extract all these takings. They've seen me leaving as an opportunity to get honest opinions from me, and it drained me a lot. And I thought about why am I in this situation? And I say, Sam, if you do believe that everything happens for a reason, and you do believe that what goes around comes around, how could you be feeling so low at the moment? And I tried to like look back at all these decisions and choices I had made for the last 3.5 years. And I believe that it all started probably 3.5 years ago when I saw the first thing that I didn't like, and I decided not to say anything. And I and I've been pondering on that a lot actually, and I've been thinking all of this could have been avoided, all this mental torment and all this shamefulness that I'm feeling. I didn't have to feel like that if I just said what I wanted to say maybe 3.5 years ago. And I've basically built up all of this myself. And yeah, as much as maybe it's other people's problems that I'm sort of pointing out, I can't help but feel totally responsible for the situation that I'm in as well. And I basically trying to find some reason why I should speak the truth. And what I'm increasingly find myself drawn closer to is anchoring my my life on something external to me. So before I felt like I can be the judge and I will be able to say, well, I don't need to say that, or I don't need to say it like this. But actually, if you have some sort of anchoring outside of you, which is, I mean, for example, historically, I've kind of used that as my fiance, my partner. So I kind of look to her as like a moral compass in some ways. So, for example, if I don't know how to respond to someone at work, I might ask her, "Is this a good thing to say? Is this a bad thing to say?" And she'll help me, give me some clarity. But ultimately, like I can't just rely on her to basically be my moral guiding like principle. It needs to be something that's above us, and how people might characterize that as God. But for me, it seems like I need to be empowered when I'm at work or when I'm in a social environment to say, no, Sam, say these things. Like you don't, like Sarah's not here, your partner's not here to describe to you like the words that you should use or whether or not you should say it. You need to back yourself essentially and say these things that come to you. But how can you back yourself if time and again you've proven to yourself that you can't be trusted just by yourself to do what you know that you should do? And so why don't you trust in something else that's going to have your back? And so that's just one line of thinking. But the sort of other conclusion that I've come to is basically when I'm starting my new job and when I'm approaching life now, I'm going to always remember this experience about how terrible I felt about having to try and contain all this information that I had and make sure it didn't get out to the wrong people and make sure I wasn't hurting people's feelings. And ultimately, I think it was rooted in my inability to speak the truth and really call out the negative things that I saw in my work 3.5 years ago. And I've even called you about troubles that I've had at work and things, and it hasn't been good on me. It's really played on my mental health a lot. So I think reaching this conclusion was so beneficial for me, which is why I say you're finally leaving, because I think it's right for me to start afresh on a new page with all the lessons and with all the experiences that I've had at this place. And yeah, I feel much more calm about approaching this new work with this new framework about calling things out when you see them. And no doubt there will be other things in life that I'm doing wrong at the moment that will lead to maybe some cataclysmic event where I'm like, oh, it was that thing that I did ages ago that has led to this. But I think that's the nature of being human, right? Is about like what we're talking about, the processes of learning in life. And so yeah, that is something I've experienced, I guess, recently. Don't know if you have any final thoughts on the podcast or in response to what I've said, but yeah, I kind of want to end on that story because I think that that's a practical real life experience that I've had that sort of ties in a lot of the ideas that we've been speaking about on this pod.
Completely agree. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting situation. And the only thing that could be worse about the situation is you not learning any lessons from it. It's the only way this could be worse. Um, so I think, you know, I also think just be kind to yourself as well, right? Like, don't beat yourself up too much about um, having kind of not spoken up necessarily when you feel like you should have. There are all sorts of reasons why people don't speak up, right? For example, it could be the case that you tried speaking up for a while, but you just got this feedback from observing nothing happening about the speaking up. But after a while, you kind of get to this learned helplessness of, well, nothing's going to change even if I do speak up. So,
Yeah.
but if anything, that's just a signal as well to leave, right? So, if things can't be changed, so all I would say is don't beat yourself up too much. Like, these things, they happen for a very complex multivariate set of reasons. So,
Hmm.
but the important thing is taking lessons.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's a great place to end it.
Awesome. Good chatting.
And you, man, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you. You too.